My questions are around the unfair trading practice reforms. In November, it was announced that agreement had been reached with the state and territory consumer affairs ministers on unfair trading practice reforms. Just curious to understand what the status of the development of legislation in that area is.
Thank you for your, Thank you for your question. Megan Trudgeon, Acting Assistant Secretary of the Competition and Consumer Branch. As you may be aware, on the 21st of November, Consumer Ministers agreed to the proposal to amend the Australian Consumer Law to introduce unfair trading protections. The new laws will have three key elements: a general prohibition on practices that manipulate consumer decision-making and consumer harm, address unfair subscription practices, which I know you're very interested in, by requiring businesses to disclose key information before signing consumers up for a subscription, notify consumers before a free trial ends, and remove unfair barriers to cancellation. And the third element is to strengthen protections on drip pricing by requiring businesses to show mandatory transaction fees prominently and upfront during that transaction. That progressing the nationwide reforms to protect consumers from unfair trading practices is an agreed priority of the Commonwealth, State and Consumer Affairs Ministers, and progression of the draft legislation has been prioritised by government as above the other consumer reforms. We do expect to be commencing the legislative process shortly, or actually immediately, and we expect to be going out for consultation in early 2026.
Early 2026, okay, that's great. Just in terms of the features of the legislation, will the legislation confer a particular sort of click-to-cancel responsibility on the subscription services?
In relation to subscriptions, the details of the legislation have yet to be settled, but in particular, we want to make sure that businesses are providing material information and make informed decisions. It will be based on a principles-based approach, so we won't necessarily be using that particular terminology. But in essence, it's aiming to achieve that the same amount of clicks and processes that you can use to sign up to a subscription should be able to be used to be cancelling that. So no unreasonable barriers to be able to cancel a subscription for consumers.
Great. And will the legislation require clear and timely auto-renewal reminders for the subscription services?
Yes. So as part of the reforms, we want to make sure that customers are required to be contacted at key points throughout the subscription, and that will include when particularly a free trial may end, just to make sure the consumers are informed about the elements of that subscription.
And will the legislation prevent forced account creation for one-time purposes or purchases, rather, so customers are not forced to create or store an account, which often results in future charges, data harvesting and unsolicited marketing?
Yeah, so that was an element that was consulted on as part of the unfair trading prohibition work. In looking at submissions and consulting with stakeholders, the primary concerns in that space were about the request of information and about the privacy of those customers. So there was a lack of stakeholders that actually supported that reform in this Australian consumer law to address that serious issue. Stakeholders primarily viewed that as a privacy-related issue and saw that the best avenue for that to be progressed is through more privacy-related reforms rather than through the consumer law.
Okay. And you mentioned drip pricing. Will the legislation address dynamic pricing based on demand levels, browsing history, the type of device used, to outlaw businesses using algorithms to increase prices for certain individual consumers based on how often they've searched for an item or what device they're using or the current demand?
So the reforms do include an element for drip pricing, which is making sure that the prices throughout a transaction are known at the start of that transaction. In relation to dynamic pricing, where pricing increases during the purchase process based on things, as you mentioned, like search history or demand during that process, consultations revealed that there was no real evidence that this was occurring to a substantial degree, and where it was occurring, that it was already adequately addressed by provisions in the consumer law, such as misleading, deceptive trading. So we understand that that is a concern, but at this point the government has decided to progress with the general prohibition, which also should assist with some of those practices, and then utilise existing provisions in the legislation such as misleading and deceptive conduct.
And so that current provision, what are the consequences of, in the instances where businesses are using dynamic pricing?
Dynamic pricing, the current provisions in the consumer law?
Yes.
So misleading and deceptive conduct is one of those key provisions which may be at play for regulators to have a look at, that if consumers are not receiving information and the pricing is not based on a fair and transparent way, that regulators would look at that on a case-by-case basis. But certainly in this space we do expect the general unfair trading prohibition to go really a long way in improving the fairness of those transactions.
And then there's also the element of manipulative urgency or scarcity tactics. Will the legislation prohibit the use of those tactics and similar pressure-based design techniques that distort purchasing decisions and create the artificial time pressure for consumers?
In relation to the specific reforms that have been progressed through legislation, the general prohibition should go a long way to addressing some of those behaviours that may be described as dark patterns, so manipulative behaviours by online platforms primarily, noting though that these provisions will apply to both online and in-person transactions. But we would expect that the general prohibition on unfair trading will capture a lot of those behaviours, as well as behaviours we've not yet seen in the market. That's the strength of a principles-based prohibition, so it can be dynamic and respond to how businesses are changing their trading practices. The detail, though, will be worked through in a legislative process as well, and a general course of business is that we would consult on that as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Just on price gouging in supermarkets, I know that the submissions to the consultation closed on 3rd of November. Just curious to understand the status of the task force advising on the excessive pricing regime.
Yeah, thank you. That one is from me as well.
Okay.
Yes. So as you're aware, the consultations closed on the 3rd of November, and the government is considering the outcomes of that consultation at the moment. So the task force met with a range of stakeholders, including supermarkets, consumer advocacy groups and industry experts as part of that consultation.
Yeah, cool. And during the last estimates hearings, I had a similar line of questions, and the Minister said the government's commitment in response to substantial community concern was to develop legislation by the end of this year. Is this still on track to occur?
Treasury is on track to support the government to deliver on that election commitment. The exact timing is a decision for government.
Minister, do you have any indication?
No, I'm sorry, but I can see if there's anything further I can provide.
I can certainly assure you, though, that we are on track to deliver on the government's commitment in that regard.
The ACCC's investigation into price gouging in supermarkets was inconclusive. Just curious to understand why is the government taking action to address a problem that may not even be a substantial cause of the cost of living crisis? That's what sort of speculations are out there, and I'm just curious to understand what rationale or reasoning there is.
The government made an election commitment to introduce certain measures, particularly excessive pricing measure in relation to supermarkets. So Treasury has been working and focusing on that. The ACCC did make a number of wide-ranging recommendations, and we're also progressing reforms on unit pricing and shrinkflation and a number of other the ACCC recommendations later on next year. Sorry.
Has Treasury done any modelling, or does Treasury believe there's price gouging occurring in our supermarkets?
I would have to take that in question or notice in terms of whether we've done any particular modelling. We've certainly spoken extensively to a number of stakeholders, both consumer groups and industry groups as well, about what price, whether you want to call it price gouging or pricing behaviours of the large supermarkets and those types of things. In terms of modelling, I'm not sure that would be something that we would have access to that type of data, because that requires information on what actual supermarkets are purchasing and what they're purchasing
products for, their costs associated with providing that supermarket service, and then the profit margins on top of that. That's the type of information that the ACCC would be seeking to obtain with the information gathering powers that would come along with the accessing pricing regime. At the moment, we don't have access to that data, but with the proposed amendments to the Food and Grocery Code to implement that, it would provide the regulator with the ability to actually have a look and probably get, whether you want to call it modelling or just be able to conduct the analysis to really see if there is excessive pricing in that space.
Yeah, okay. And yeah, I can wrap up. So just on the previous estimates, or round of estimates, when the Minister was asked whether the government would support other sectors being subject to price gouging bans, he said, we're not going to complicate it and have a delay, we're going to get on with it. Would the government consider expanding the laws in the future?
I think whether the government wants to make a decision on expanding the laws is a matter for government. In relation to the mandate that Treasury was given in relation to supermarkets was to focus on the supermarket sector. We're certainly always speaking to stakeholders about market concerns in other sectors as well, but whether the government chooses to proceed with that would be a matter for government.
Minister, would you like to comment on that?
No, we've got the commitments that we've made already, and we're on track to deliver those as per the election commitment, but that's been the focus to date.
Thank you.